Beneath the merciless sun, where the desert stretched endlessly in waves of gold and silence, a single moment waited to alter the course of an ordinary life. The air shimmered with heat, the horizon wavering like liquid fire, and the sound of hooves pressed steadily against the dry earth. He rode through that sea of dust and solitude, expecting nothing more than another day of survival, unaware that fate was waiting just beyond the ridge. The Arizona wilderness was a place that devoured the unprepared, its winds carrying whispers of both death and hidden miracles. And it was in that unforgiving place that he saw it, the flicker of a shadow that did not belong to sand or stone, but to a human soul trembling on the edge of life. At first, it looked like a mirage, the kind a man might imagine after long hours under the blistering sky. But when the figure collapsed into the sand with finality, he knew it was real. Urging his horse forward, he found her lying at his feet, a woman, worn and torn, her face pale, her breath shallow, her dark hair tangled with sand as though the desert itself had tried to claim her. Her lips were cracked, her eyes dim yet defiant, as if she had crossed fire and storm only to meet him here, in this lonely expanse. In that instant, the world stilled, and the silence pressed down with the weight of destiny. He could have passed by, could have left her to the cruelty of the desert winds, but something within him stirred, something tender, healing, a quiet force that whispered that life, even in its most fragile form, was worth saving. He lifted her gently, her body as light as a bird in his arms, and laid her across the saddle. She did not resist. She simply surrendered, her trust given to a stranger with the last fragments of her strength. The desert stretched out before them, unforgiving, yet strangely holy, as if watching, waiting to see what would come of this encounter. Dust rose behind as the horse surged forward toward the memory of a spring beyond the ridge, the only place where water still lingered in this vast ocean of sand. Every breath she drew was shallow, every second a struggle, yet still she endured. He felt the weight of her life pressing into his chest, not as a burden, but as a call he could not ignore. When they reached the spring, he lowered her carefully, kneeling by her side. The water glistened like liquid glass beneath the sun, a healing gift in the heart of desolation. He lifted a canteen to her lips, and though she hesitated, suspicion flickering in her eyes, thirst soon overpowered fear. She drank greedily, the water spilling across her chin, and as it touched her lips, colour slowly began to return. Still, she remained guarded, her eyes sharp, testing him, as if to ask whether his kindness was true or merely another mask of betrayal. He did not speak. He only offered what little comfort he could, a blanket, water, safety in his presence. Sometimes silence carries more healing than words, and in that silence the fragile threads of trust began to form. The ride to his cabin was long, but she rested against him, her head brushing his shoulder with a quiet that pierced deeper than speech. The rhythm of the horse's hooves became a heartbeat of survival, carrying them both through the wilderness. He felt her breath, uneven but steady, and something in him softened, a warmth that had been buried beneath years of solitude. He realized he was no longer riding only for himself. He carried the fragile hope of another, and that hope began to light something new within him. His cabin was small, nothing more than wood and stone pressed against the edge of the desert, but in that moment it became a sanctuary. He laid her upon his bed, wrapped her in a blanket, and tended to her wounds with the care of a man who understood that life was sacred. Day after day he stayed by her side, preparing broth, offering water, watching her spirit flicker between shadows of despair and glimmers of strength. She rarely spoke, only a word or two in broken English, but her eyes spoke with volumes of unspoken history. Sometimes suspicion sharpened their gaze, sometimes gratitude softened them, but always they searched him, measuring the truth of his soul. Nights fell heavy with desert winds, coyotes crying in the distance, the world outside wild and unforgiving. Yet inside, within the humble cabin, there grew a fragile peace, like a seed sheltered from the storm. She watched him by the fire, her shoulders slowly easing, as trust grew like dawn after a long night. One evening, her voice, soft and trembling yet strong with resolve, cut through the silence. "You helped me when no one else would." Those words hung in the air, sacred as a vow. And though he did not yet understand what they meant, he felt the weight of destiny binding itself around his life. The desert had always been a place of survival, where men fought only for another day. But now, as he looked at the fragile figure who had collapsed at his feet and chosen to trust him with her final strength, he understood something greater. This was not just survival. It was a beginning, one born of mercy, gratitude, and a quiet promise that love, unexpected, unlooked for, was already taking root beneath the endless skies. And just as the stars would soon ignite across the heavens, so too would this bond grow brighter, guiding them both into a story neither had expected to write. If this moment stirs something in your heart, if the healing rhythm of their meeting reminds you of how fragile and precious love can be, let this story breathe further with you. Share your thoughts in the comments, leave a light of encouragement by subscribing, and let your presence here become part of this journey. Every word, every gesture of support is like water in the desert, small but life-giving. Stay, walk with this tale, and feel the warmth of what is still to come, for the next chapter will carry us deeper into the heart of trust, destiny, and a love born beneath the burning sun. The days that followed unfolded like a fragile tapestry, each thread woven from silence, care, and the faint rhythm of healing breaths echoing within the small cabin. The desert outside remained merciless, winds sweeping across the rocks, coyotes howling at night, storms of dust rising like restless ghosts. But inside those wooden walls, a quiet sanctuary began to take shape. She lay upon the bed in stillness, her body bearing the marks of a journey too cruel to recount, yet her spirit refused to break. Every dawn, light filtered through the cracks in the wood, laying golden patterns across her face, and in that gentle light he found a reason to rise. He brought her water before the sun grew harsh, warmed broth by the fire, and sat near her side, never asking for more than she could give. At first she resisted his kindness with guarded eyes. Her silence carried stories too heavy for words, her every glance a test, as if she feared the safety offered was merely an illusion that would shatter like glass. Yet patience was his shield, and gentleness his language. He never pressed, never demanded. Instead, he allowed her to choose the moments she wished to meet his gaze, and when those moments came, however brief, they left behind echoes deeper than conversation. Trust, like a delicate bloom in the desert, cannot be forced. It rises only when it feels the warmth of sincerity. And slowly, beneath the weight of his quiet devotion, Her shoulders began to ease, her breathing less shadowed by fear. One evening, as twilight stretched its lavender veil across the horizon, he returned from gathering wood to find her sitting up for the first time. The blanket rested loosely over her shoulders, her hair cascading in dark waves tangled by days of wind, her eyes reflecting the firelight with a mix of caution and wonder. She said nothing, but the silence she held no longer felt heavy with suspicion. It felt like an invitation, a fragile opening through which something unspoken passed between them. He placed the wood gently by the hearth, his every motion careful, as though afraid any sudden gesture might scatter the fragile trust forming in the air. When he sat near the fire, she watched him with an expression that carried gratitude, but also something more, an unnameable depth, like the desert sky that revealed endless stars only to those patient enough to wait for night. That night, the wind roared through the desert, as if reminding them how small humans are against the vastness of nature. Yet within the cabin, the storm became only a distant song, muffled by the warmth of fire and presence. He carved wood quietly, shaping a piece without purpose, simply to keep his hands moving. Then, for the first time, her hand reached across the fragile distance, resting lightly over his. Her touch was warm, deliberate, steady. It startled him, not because of its suddenness, but because of the meaning it carried. It was not merely a gesture of thanks. It was a declaration of trust, given after days of silence and suspicion. When he lifted his eyes to hers, he found a gaze that shimmered with vulnerability, yet stood unshaken by fear. Her lips trembled slightly before she spoke, her voice soft but weighted with the gravity of choice. "You helped me when no one else would." The words were halting, her English broken, but each syllable carried the essence of truth, of recognition, of something larger than gratitude. She paused, searching his eyes, and though she did not yet finish what she meant to say, he felt the promise already linger in the air. Something unspoken bound them, fragile yet undeniable, like the silver thread of moonlight weaving its way through the dark window. In the following days, as her strength returned, she moved with quiet dignity around the cabin. She gathered water with him, attempted to mend the torn fabric of her dress with trembling hands, and sometimes sat outside near the threshold, letting the wind play through her hair while her eyes followed the horizon. He never questioned her silence, but he felt the weight of her presence transform the space around him. Where once his cabin had been filled with loneliness, now it carried the warmth of shared existence. Even without words, their days unfolded in harmony, two lives adjusting to one another, not through force, but through the healing rhythm of patience and care. There were moments when her eyes lingered on him with an intensity that unsettled him, as if she were still measuring whether his soul could be trusted with more than her life. And yet, in those same moments, he saw glimmers of something deeper. Gratitude softened into affection, wariness blurred into longing, and silence filled with the possibility of a future neither had dared to imagine. She became less the fragile figure he had rescued, and more a presence that breathed new meaning into his days. Every gesture she made, whether placing a bowl before him or simply folding a blanket, seemed to carry layers of significance, as though she was weaving herself carefully into the fabric of his life. One evening, as the sun spilled red and gold across the horizon and shadows lengthened within the cabin, she stood beside him longer than before, her hands clutching the blanket around her shoulders. The firelight reflected in her eyes as she whispered words that startled him into silence. A promise, an offering, spoken with resolve that belied her fragile state. It was not spoken like a question, nor like a plea. It was spoken as truth, as destiny unveiled. And though he could not yet grasp its full meaning, the weight of it pressed into his heart, stirring both wonder and fear. For in that moment he understood that this encounter in the desert was no accident. It was a turning point, one that would carry him toward paths he had never thought to walk, toward bonds he had never thought to form. The desert outside raged on with its storms, indifferent to human hearts, but within that modest cabin a seed had been planted, fragile, healing, alive. And with each breath she drew more steadily, with each glance that softened between them, the promise of something greater grew. Soon this quiet bond would stretch beyond survival into a destiny that neither could deny, a bridge between worlds built not by chance, but by choice. The fire burned lower, the night pressed close, and as he watched her eyes linger on him with a softness that spoke louder than words, he knew their story was only beginning, carrying them toward a horizon that shimmered with love unspoken, yet already alive. The days grew longer, each one carrying with it a rhythm that seemed both fragile and eternal, as though time itself had slowed to watch the two lives weaving silently together. The desert beyond the cabin remained wild and unforgiving, but inside those walls there blossomed a fragile world of quiet trust and hidden tenderness. She no longer lay weak and trembling upon the bed. Her body had begun to gather strength, her movements steadier, her presence less shadowed by suffering. He noticed how the color returned to her cheeks, how her eyes no longer darted with suspicion, but lingered with a cautious openness. Though words between them remained scarce, every silence became a language, and in that language something unspoken was taking root. Each morning he rose with the first blush of dawn, gathering water or tending the small fire that kept the cabin warm, and she would sometimes watch him from her place near the hearth. Her gaze carried the weight of someone who had endured storms, yet beneath that weight there was an ember of something softer, gratitude, perhaps, or the beginning of trust. He offered her food, simple meals prepared with what little he had, and though she spoke no thanks aloud, the way her eyes softened as she accepted each offering spoke more than words ever could. Slowly, carefully, her silence transformed from distance into a kind of shared peace, a healing quiet that wrapped around them both like the comfort of dusk after a day of burning sun. On the third evening, as the horizon bled into crimson and gold, he found her sitting outside the cabin, the blanket draped around her shoulders, her hair falling loose in dark waves that caught the last light. The desert stretched endlessly before them, harsh yet breathtaking, its vastness mirroring the unspoken distance between their worlds. He stepped outside and sat a short space away, giving her the choice to close the distance or preserve it. For a long time, neither spoke. The wind brushed gently through the sparse trees, carrying with it the scent of earth cooling after the long day, and the silence between them became a bridge rather than a barrier. When at last her eyes turned to him, he felt the weight of that gaze settle into his chest. She did not need to speak. Her look carried with it a quiet acknowledgement that something had changed, that the bond between them had begun to take shape. That night, as the fire cracked softly within the cabin, she moved closer, sitting at his side. He carved wood slowly, his hands steady though his heart raced with the awareness of her nearness. Then her hand, delicate yet firm, rested over his. It was a touch filled with meaning, a gesture that carried both vulnerability and resolve. His breath caught, for in that simple contact lay 1,000 unspoken truths. Her trust, her gratitude, her willingness to step beyond fear. Her voice followed, soft and trembling, carrying words shaped by broken English, but bound with the clarity of her heart. "You helped me when no one else would." Each syllable was fragile, yet they struck him with a force greater than any storm. He could not answer at once, for his chest ached with the weight of all that her words implied. It was more than thanks. It was a vow, a recognition that what had begun in desperation was becoming something sacred. She searched his eyes, her own shimmering with both hesitation and determination, as though she wanted him to see the depth of what she offered without needing to clothe it fully in words. And though he remained silent, his heart spoke in its own way, reaching out toward the fragile promise that hovered between them. In the days that followed, the fragile bond deepened through gestures small yet profound. She began to move with purpose around the cabin, sweeping the floor with quiet dignity, preparing simple meals, mending cloth with patient hands. She no longer appeared as the broken figure he had first found in the desert. She revealed instead the quiet strength of a woman who had endured hardship and still carried within her the will to nurture life. Her presence filled the cabin with a warmth it had never known before, as though her spirit had infused even the simplest acts with meaning. For him, every glance she offered became a moment to treasure, every shared silence a thread binding them closer. Sometimes, at night, he would catch her watching him with eyes that shimmered like the stars scattered across the desert sky. There was still caution in her gaze, still the remnants of wounds not easily forgotten, but alongside that caution there now lived a gentleness, an unspoken invitation. It was as though she was asking whether his kindness was a fleeting act or something that could endure, whether the bridge forming between them could hold the weight of two worlds. And each time their eyes met, he let her see his answer not through speech but through presence, steady, patient, unwavering. The desert, with all its harshness, became the backdrop for something unexpected, a love not yet spoken, but already alive. Every shared task, every quiet glance, every brush of hands when passing a bowl of water carried with it a growing tenderness, fragile yet undeniable. The storms outside reminded them of how small and vulnerable human life could be. Yet within the cabin the air shimmered with warmth, as though the fire they tended together was not only of wood and flame, but of trust, of companionship, of something deeper than either dared to name. And so the bond grew, quiet and unhurried, like roots pressing deep into the earth beneath the desert sand. What had begun as survival was transforming into something greater, a promise still unspoken, a future not yet defined, but already felt in the steady rhythm of two hearts learning to move together. And though neither could yet foresee what lay beyond the horizon, both knew that destiny had already begun its work, binding them gently, inexorably, toward a path that would carry them further than either had imagined. The night closed around them, the fire dimmed, and as they sat in the stillness, the silence itself became a vow, leading them softly, tenderly, into the next chapter of their story. The promise she had whispered that night lingered in the air long after the fire had burned low, and though he had not spoken in return, his silence had not been rejection. It was reverence, the quiet acceptance of something far greater than words could carry. In the days that followed, her strength grew, her movements surer, her presence within the cabin no longer that of a fragile guest, but of someone who belonged. She swept the floor with graceful determination, tended the small fire with steady hands, and even began to hum softly in her own tongue as she worked, a sound so delicate it wrapped around him like healing balm. It was as though the cabin, once filled only with solitude and the echoes of his own breath, had been given a soul. He found himself watching her in quiet awe, tracing the dignity that lived in her every gesture. She was no longer only the woman he had rescued from the desert. She had become a presence that filled the space with warmth, reshaping it into something alive. Sometimes she caught him staring, and when their eyes met, she did not look away immediately. There was still a guarded spark, but now it mingled with curiosity, perhaps even a growing tenderness. It struck him that trust is not given all at once. It is layered, like the slow unfurling of dawn across the horizon. And every glance, every quiet moment shared, added a new layer between them. On one evening, when the sun bled its final colors into the desert sky, she sat near him by the fire, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes steady. There was a solemnity to her gaze, the weight of something unsaid, pressing against the silence. He waited, patient, sensing that the desert itself held its breath. At last, she spoke, not many words, but enough to shift the ground beneath him. Her voice, though halting, carried clarity. She wished to give him something more enduring than gratitude, a bond that reached into the fabric of family and future. The suggestion of marriage hung between them, spoken not as a plea, not as a bargain, but as a declaration rooted in honor. For a moment, he could not breathe. Marriage had not been part of his path. He had lived in this barren land with only survival as his compass, never daring to imagine companionship, let alone the binding of two worlds. Yet as her words sank into him, he understood that this was no ordinary proposal. It was her way of saying that trust had been forged in fire, that gratitude had transformed into something unshakable. His heart pounded with conflicting tides, fear of the unknown, awe at the depth of her offering, and a quiet recognition that destiny had led him here for more than chance. He did not answer immediately, for the weight of such a vow deserved silence before it deserved speech. Instead, he allowed his gaze to linger upon her face, illuminated by firelight, seeing in her eyes both determination and vulnerability. She was offering him not just herself, but the bridge between two lives, two worlds long separated by suspicion and distance. He nodded slowly, not as consent fully spoken, but as an acknowledgment that her words had taken root within him. She seemed to understand, her expression softening, and though she did not press further, a quiet peace settled between them, as though the promise had already begun to take form. In the days that followed, she moved with a purpose that surprised him. She carried herself not as a guest recovering from hardship, but as a woman preparing for something sacred. Her steps were sure, her hands steady, and though her words were few, her eyes often sought his with a silent question. Would he walk this path with her? And he found himself restless beneath the weight of that question, not out of reluctance, but out of reverence for what it meant. He had always believed himself destined to walk this land alone. Yet now, each glance she gave him carved open the possibility of a life far richer, filled with companionship, warmth, and meaning. One evening, As the desert wind whispered through the cracks in the wood, she reached for his hand again, placing it gently in hers. Her touch was steady, as though to remind him that this was no dream. In that moment, he felt the quiet, healing power of her presence, how it had seeped into his bones without him realizing. She had become more than a figure rescued. She had become a force reshaping the very course of his days. And though words still failed him, the silence he gave her carried more weight than any declaration. Silence can hold a vow, and in that vow, a future began to unfold. The desert outside remained untamed, storms rising and falling, yet inside, within the glow of fire and the warmth of two souls learning one another, something enduring took root. What had started as survival now moved into the realm of destiny. Their bond, once fragile as wind-blown sand, was becoming strong, steady, inevitable. And as night deepened and the stars began their watch across the vast Arizona sky, he realized that her offering was not something to fear. It was a gift, the chance to step out of solitude and into a love that was healing, unlooked for, but profoundly alive. The fire burned low, their hands remained joined, and in that unspoken union the path ahead revealed itself, leading them gently toward the next chapter, where love would no longer be a whisper, but a promise made flesh. The week after her words had settled into his heart, unfolded with a rhythm both unsettling and tender, like a song he did not know, yet somehow recognized. She no longer seemed bound only to his cabin. There was purpose in her steps, quiet dignity in the way she carried herself, and a sense that she was preparing the way for something larger than either of them could see. And then, one morning, she vanished at dawn, leaving behind only the soft impression of her presence woven into the blanket she had folded neatly by the bed. For a moment, fear gripped him, that perhaps she had slipped away into the desert's cruel embrace, leaving their fragile bond unfinished. But as the sun began to tilt westward, the sound of hooves carried across the dry earth, and when he stepped outside, he saw her returning, not alone. Beside her rode a young woman, tall, poised, her hair long and dark, flowing like a river of midnight against the blazing horizon. She carried herself with strength, yet her face bore a gentleness that softened the harsh lines of survival etched by desert life. When she dismounted, her movements were unhurried, rooted with confidence, yet her eyes lowered respectfully, modest but unafraid. The older woman introduced her with quiet pride, her voice carrying the weight of something sacred. This was her daughter, the gift she had spoken of, the promise she had laid upon his hands by the fire. He stood speechless, his breath caught between awe and disbelief. The daughter's presence stirred something within him that words could not reach. She was not a fragile soul seeking protection, not a fleeting vision carried by gratitude, but a being of her own, strong, enduring, luminous, with quiet resilience. She bore the marks of labor upon her hands, the firmness of someone who had endured hardship without breaking, and yet her eyes, those eyes, held the gentleness of flowing water, soft enough to heal, steady enough to endure. When their gazes met only for a fleeting heartbeat, it was as though the desert itself paused, as though the vast horizon bent closer to listen. That evening, the three of them shared a simple meal. The fire crackled, the desert wind pressed against the cabin's walls, and yet within there was warmth that surpassed the storm outside. Conversation moved sparingly, bridged by gestures, smiles, the translation of the mother's words when needed. The daughter spoke in her native tongue, her voice low and melodious, while he answered in fragments of broken speech, his English tempered by her halting attempts to meet him halfway. At first, the dissonance seemed wide, two languages colliding without rhythm. But as the meal went on, laughter began to slip through the gaps, small chuckles at mispronunciations, smiles at misunderstandings, the lightness of two souls choosing to reach across the distance. He felt like a guest in his own cabin, surrounded by words he did not know, traditions that were not his, yet instead of unease, there was reverence. These were not strangers imposing upon his solitude. They were inviting him into something sacred. The older woman watched them with quiet satisfaction, her eyes reflecting firelight and certainty, as though she had always known their paths would meet here, beneath this roof, on this soil. He sensed that this was no matter of convenience, no arrangement shaped by necessity. It was a weaving of honor, gratitude, and spirit, a bond recognized before either he or the daughter could fully grasp its depth. Later that night, when the others had withdrawn into silence, he stepped outside. The desert sky stretched endlessly above, heavy with stars that burned like scattered embers across the dark. He lifted his face to them, his heart unsettled not with fear, but with wonder. He had never thought of marriage, never thought of companionship beyond the raw demands of survival. Yet here it was, a vision laid before him as clear as the silver arc of the moon. The possibility of family, of connection, of a life no longer defined only by solitude. In the days that followed, the daughter and her mother visited often. Together they wove a rhythm into his days that had never existed before. She moved beside him when he gathered water, her hands steady, her strength quiet but unyielding. She knelt by the fire, mending cloth with patient focus, her voice occasionally rising in song, soft, lilting notes in her language that curled through the cabin like smoke, wrapping everything in warmth. And though words still faltered between them, their silences grew rich. They learned to speak in gestures, in glances, in the rhythm of hands passing bowls, in the subtle pauses where laughter found its way. He began to see her more clearly with each passing day. Beyond her strength, he noticed the kindness that radiated through the smallest things, the way she brushed crumbs from the table with care, the way she steadied a cup before setting it down, the way she smiled, not quickly but deeply, as though every curve of her lips carried meaning. She was not simply the daughter of a woman he had saved. She was a world in herself, and that world was opening before him like a horizon after storm. And in those moments he finally understood what the mother had meant when she had spoken with such certainty. Gratitude had been the seed, but this was something more. This was balance. He had given his strength in saving a life, but in return, life was offering him a companion who could meet him not as a shadow, but as an equal flame. The desert, which had always felt like a place of endings, now revealed itself as the beginning of something enduring, something sacred. One evening, as dusk folded into night, the mother placed his hand into her daughter's without a word. No explanation was needed. The weight of the gesture carried the fullness of a vow. When he looked into her eyes, for the first time she did not look away. Instead, she held his gaze steady, her expression soft but unwavering, and in her quiet smile he found the answer to all the questions that had troubled him. It was not merely gratitude, not merely destiny, but love, gentle, healing, and alive, stretching between them like the eternal desert sky, promising that what had begun in chance was now written in the stars above. The days after their hands were joined moved with a rhythm that felt almost sacred, as if the desert itself had slowed its breath to witness what was unfolding. Each sunrise came wrapped in golden fire, spilling over the horizon like a blessing, and each night descended in silence so vast it seemed to carry the weight of eternity. Between those hours of blazing heat and cooling dusk, their lives began to weave together with a gentleness that felt both healing and unbreakable. He had once lived by habit, survival his only compass, but now every moment carried meaning. The presence of the daughter beside him was no longer just an unexpected gift. It had become a quiet necessity, a force that steadied his steps, softened his solitude, and filled the spaces of his world with warmth. Language was still broken between them, yet it no longer felt like a barrier. He would stumble through words in her tongue, clumsy yet sincere, and she would reply in fractured English, each of them laughing softly at mistakes that only deepened their closeness. Sometimes they spoke not at all, working side by side in silence, gathering water from the spring, preparing simple meals, tending to the fire. But the silence was no longer empty. It had become a language of its own, filled with shared glances, small smiles, and the steady rhythm of two lives learning one another. Even when words failed, trust spoke clearly, and affection grew like a tender vine, wrapping itself around stone, softening what once was hard and unyielding. He marveled at the balance she carried, how strength lived easily beside gentleness in her. She could carry heavy buckets of water across uneven ground without complaint, her steps sure, her posture firm. Yet he would watch the same hands cradle a fragile bird that had fallen near the cabin, whispering soothing sounds until it regained its breath. It struck him that she embodied the very essence of the desert, unyielding to storms, yet capable of holding life with tenderness. Every time he saw her move, whether through work or through quiet rest, he felt his heart bind tighter to her, not with the urgency of passion alone, but with the steady certainty of belonging. At dusk, they often sat outside, the mother close by, the three of them sharing the fading light as the desert shifted from gold to violet. The daughter's hair caught the last fire of the sun, her eyes glowing with reflections of the horizon. Sometimes she would speak of her people, her words translated gently by her mother. Stories of traditions, songs of ancestors, fragments of wisdom carried through generations. He listened with reverence, feeling himself drawn into a world that had existed long before he had come. A world strong and enduring, one he had never expected to be welcomed into. These moments filled him with a humility so profound it was almost painful. Yet within that humility lived a sense of healing, a reminder that life was greater when shared, that even broken paths could lead to harmony. There were evenings when the desert wind howled outside, rattling the walls of the cabin, but within, warmth prevailed. The fire glowed, shadows danced across the wood, and she sat near him, her hands busy with sewing or stirring a pot, her presence steady as a heartbeat. Occasionally their eyes met across the flicker of flames, and in that gaze there was no need for speech. Her look told him she trusted him, that she had chosen him, that whatever storms life still held, they would face them together. For him, those glances became more powerful than any vows spoken beneath the stars, because they were not bound in ritual or ceremony, they were bound in truth, in lived moments, in the steady rhythm of love that asked for nothing but gave everything. One night, when the air grew unusually still, the mother placed her hand gently on his shoulder, her eyes solemn, filled with both gratitude and certainty. She spoke in her tongue, her voice low but unwavering, and though he understood little, the daughter translated softly, her voice like a whisper that wrapped around him. "This bond is sacred. Not of chance, but of spirit. My mother says you saved her life, and now she has given you mine, not as a debt, but as a path." The weight of those words sank into him like roots pressing deep into soil. He looked into the daughter's eyes and saw not only gratitude, but an unshakable choice, a love that was beginning to flower quietly, yet with a force that could endure any storm. That night, as they stepped outside together, the desert sky opened above them, infinite and dazzling. Stars burned across the heavens, each one a witness to the silent promises already alive between them. He reached for her hand, not hesitantly, but with the steadiness of someone who had finally accepted what fate had given. She did not withdraw, her fingers laced with his, firm and warm, and in that simple act the silence of the desert became holy. Neither spoke, for neither needed to. The stars themselves seemed to murmur that the path ahead, though unknown, was already theirs to walk. The days turned into a rhythm of shared labor and quiet joy, and he found himself no longer thinking of survival alone. He thought of her laughter, of the way her presence softened even the harshest hours, of the way her mother watched them with a knowing smile, as if she had always foreseen this. He thought of the future, of a home no longer defined by loneliness, of children who might one day laugh within these walls, of traditions woven together across cultures that had once stood apart. The thought no longer frightened him. Instead, it filled him with peace, with healing, with the certainty that the desert had not been meant to take from him, but to give. And as the season shifted, bringing cooler winds and gentler skies, he understood that what had begun as a single act of mercy on a burning afternoon had grown into something vast and unshakable. Love had arrived not with thunder or fire, but with silence, with trust, with patience, with the healing presence of a woman whose spirit matched his own. It was a love written not in words, but in the rhythm of shared days, the kind of love that did not need to declare itself, because it was already alive in every glance, every gesture, every moment. And with that love, a new horizon opened, carrying them forward toward the chapter that would test, strengthen, and deepen all they had begun. The bond that had begun in silence grew into something stronger with each passing day, deepening like the roots of a tree that stretched unseen beneath the earth, yet held fast through every storm. The desert around them remained unchanged, fierce by day, tender beneath its blanket of stars by night. But within the cabin, life had shifted into a new rhythm. It was no longer the solitude of one man enduring the wilderness. It was the warmth of shared moments, of small gestures that carried infinite meaning, of a love unspoken yet undeniably alive. He felt it in the way her footsteps sounded alongside his when they walked to the spring, in the way her laughter slipped free when a word in his broken speech twisted into unintended humor, in the way she leaned closer without hesitation when the nights grew cold. Every task, once heavy with loneliness, became lighter when carried together. Gathering wood was no longer a chore, but an occasion to watch the sun rise upon her face, to hear her voice humming softly as she carried bundles back to the cabin. Preparing meals became more than survival. It became ritual, the mingling of her careful hands with his rough ones, the exchange of glances across the fire, the quiet acknowledgement that what they shared was no longer necessity but choice. Even silence became precious, a healing stillness where hearts spoke to one another without words. He came to realize that love was not only in grand confessions, but in the smallest rhythms, the passing of a bowl, the brushing of fingers, the lingering of her eyes upon him as the fire burned low. Her mother often sat watching them, her eyes filled with a wisdom that seemed to stretch beyond time. She did not speak often, but when she did, her words carried the weight of generations, reminding them both that what they were building was not merely personal but sacred. There was honor in it, a weaving together of paths that might once have seemed too distant to cross. He felt humbled by that truth, recognizing that love here was not only about two hearts, but about the healing of histories, the joining of worlds. One evening, as the desert turned gold with the dying sun, he and the daughter walked beyond the cabin, their hands brushing but not yet fully joined. The earth stretched endless before them, the horizon wide and free, and for a moment he felt the enormity of what lay ahead press into his chest. He turned to her, searching her face for doubt, for hesitation, but found only steadiness in her eyes. She gazed at him as though she saw not only the man who had rescued her mother, but the man who might stand beside her through every season yet to come. Without words, she reached for his hand, threading her fingers with his, and the world seemed to still around them. The desert winds softened, the air grew warm with the weight of promise, and the sky above unfolded in endless hues. That simple touch sealed what no ceremony could fully capture, the beginning of a life they would walk together, equal, enduring, healing. The nights that followed carried a quiet intimacy that grew without force. He found himself listening for her voice even in silence, seeking the comfort of her nearness in the soft hours before dawn. Sometimes she would sit by the fire, her hair cascading over her shoulders, her face lit by amber light, and he would watch her as though committing every detail to memory. She was strength wrapped in gentleness, resilience touched with grace, and he marveled at the way she had come into his life not as something sought, but as something given. It felt as though the desert itself, harsh and unforgiving, had offered this unexpected gift, reminding him that beauty could bloom even in the most barren places. He often thought of how chance had brought them together, the figure collapsing in the sand, the decision to stop, the small acts of kindness that had built into something larger than either of them could contain. And yet, as he looked at her now, he no longer believed it was chance. It was something greater, something that had been waiting for both of them, guiding their steps until the moment they could finally meet. Fate had not spoken in thunder or flame, but in whispers, in a canteen of water offered, in a blanket shared, in the silent trust of a hand resting over his by firelight. Those whispers had become a song, and that song now played quietly between them, a melody that needed no words to be understood. The mother, watching them one night, placed both their hands together and said nothing more. Her silence was its own blessing, her eyes carrying the satisfaction of a promise fulfilled. He looked into the daughter's gaze, no longer tentative, no longer fleeting, and found there a love that was steady, healing, alive. For the first time, He allowed himself to imagine the years ahead, not as lonely days marked only by survival, but as seasons filled with shared labor, laughter, and children's voices echoing against the desert hills. The thought did not frighten him. It filled him with warmth, with the peace of knowing that his life had found its purpose not in the solitude of endurance, but in the companionship of love. The desert, once only a place of survival, had become a witness to transformation. Beneath its burning sun and infinite stars, two hearts had discovered each other, and in doing so had found not just comfort, but destiny. Their story was no longer about chance meetings or desperate rescues. It was about choice, about the decision to trust, to give, to love without reservation. And as the horizon opened wide before them, they stepped into it together, bound by something stronger than fear, deeper than gratitude, more enduring than the storms that would surely come. Love had taken root in silence, grown in patience, and now stretched toward a future that shimmered with promise. And so the days unfolded like a hymn, carrying them toward the moment when love would no longer live only in gestures and glances, but in the shaping of a life together, a life built upon the fragile yet unbreakable truth that healing and love can bloom even in the harshest of deserts, if only hearts are willing to open. The fire burned softly, the stars spread wide, and the story continued, leading them gently toward the next horizon. The union between them no longer lived in silences and gestures alone. It had become the rhythm of their days, a steady current flowing beneath everything they did. The desert, once a place of isolation, now breathed with the warmth of shared presence. Every dawn, the first light touched their cabin with quiet promise, and every evening as the sky spilled over with gold and crimson, they sat side by side, watching as shadows folded into night. It was not only companionship they had found, but a home within each other, a healing refuge built upon trust, resilience, and a love that deepened like roots drinking unseen water beneath the scorched earth. Seasons shifted gently. The harsh sun gave way to cooler winds, and then the desert bloomed with fragile flowers, their colors defying the barrenness of the land. He had thought once that nothing lasting could take root here. Yet beside her, he learned that even in the most unforgiving places, life could flourish. She was his reminder of this truth, her laughter spilling like fresh rain after drought, her hands steady as she wove strength and tenderness into their shared existence. She became the anchor to his wandering soul, the one who gave meaning to every act, from gathering water to preparing meals, from tending the fire to resting beneath the stars. Her mother's presence remained a quiet blessing. Often she sat nearby with calm eyes, watching as their bond grew, offering neither command nor pressure, but silent affirmation. It was as though she had always known this union was written before they even recognized it themselves. When her hand once more joined theirs together, no words were needed. The promise was already alive, carried in the way they looked at one another, in the way their hearts moved as one. It was not obligation, not repayment of a debt, but love chosen freely, healing the loneliness he had carried for years. The daughter's presence transformed not only the cabin, but also the man himself. Where once his life had been marked by solitude and endurance, now it carried gentleness, patience, and purpose. He discovered joy in the smallest details, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear as she worked, the way her eyes glowed with quiet fire when she spoke of her people, the way she touched his arm lightly when words were too heavy. He no longer saw himself as merely surviving in the desert. He was building something sacred, a life where two worlds met and found balance, a home where love grew quietly yet powerfully, like the desert's hidden springs. Evenings became their most cherished hours. They would sit by the fire, her hand resting in his, the silence between them filled with unspoken devotion. Sometimes she would hum softly, songs passed down through generations, melodies that seemed to carry the healing of ages. He would close his eyes, listening, feeling the music seep into him like water into parched ground. The desert wind pressed against the cabin, coyotes cried in the distance, yet within there was only peace, as though the storms of the world could never reach the warmth they had built. He began to see their love as a bridge, not only between himself and her, but between two ways of life, two traditions, two hearts that had been shaped by struggle, yet had found one another in kindness. What had started as an act of mercy had become a path toward destiny, a testament to the truth that love often arrives where we least expect it, carrying the power to heal wounds deeper than words can name. It was not chance. It was the hand of something greater, weaving their stories together beneath the endless sky. One night, as the stars burned like scattered fire above them, she smiled at him, her eyes shining with steady light, and for the first time he fully understood what she had given him. Not merely companionship, not only gratitude, but a life worth living, rich with meaning, shaped by love, softened by healing, and alive with promise. He took her hand, and together they looked out across the desert, no longer seeing emptiness, but a horizon that stretched with infinite possibility. The night air was cool, the fire warm, and the bond between them unshakable. The desert had not taken from him after all. It had given him everything. If this story touched your heart, if the warmth of their journey brought even a moment of peace or healing to your soul, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice is part of this journey, and if you wish to walk further with stories like this, filled with love, hope, and the quiet power of destiny, let your light shine by liking this video and subscribing. Each gesture of support, no matter how small, is a gift as precious as water in the desert, helping this story continue to grow and reach others who long for healing and love.